I'm pleased today to introduce our visiting scholar in practice for this session, Mr. Doug Ammar. Doug is the executive director and a project attorney with the Georgia Justice Project. A graduate of Davidson College and Washington and Lee University School of Law, Doug has been associated with the project almost since its inception. First, he was a volunteer during the summer prior to law school, and since he came to Atlanta in 1989, he has worked at the project, and he became project attorney in May of 1990. Doug became the executive director of Georgia Justice Project in January of 1995. We're thrilled to have him here with us today. Please join me in welcoming him.
First of all, I'm titled this talk I give. I call it, Visions of Justice, and I use one of my favorite stories, one of my favorite movies, Les Misérables. Most folks call it Les Mis for short. That's the Broadway play. And some of you might know that I like to do, when I give talks, I like to use movies. I'm a movie person. And so much so that when I was in law school, actually, I was the movie reviewer for the law school paper, which sort of deepened my commitment. It really came about from a first job I had in my freshman year of college. And I'm from West Virginia originally. And there was a coal strike that summer. And when there's a coal strike in that part of the world, there's no economic movement. So I had a hard time getting a job. 2 weeks, I beat the pavement, had one of my dad's old briefcases and the only suit I had, and I couldn't convince the guy at McDonald's. The really sad part was when the guy at McDonald's came to me and he said, "Look, I just think you're overqualified for this job." I'm like, I'm a college freshman. I want to flip burgers. He's like, "No, you're overqualified." So the only thing open at that point was a new movie theater down the street, and they were hiring, and so I got a job. And I worked there for summers and any break I could, and so I got deeply into movies at that point. So that's to blame for why I use movies for these talks. So I just wanted my background. All right, so we're gonna have some interaction here, but we're gonna set the stage. All right. So Les Mis. First of all, how many of you know the story of Les Misérables or Les Mis? Okay, how many of you know the story? So we have a few. Okay, who doesn't know the story at all? This is important because there's a long story. Who doesn't know the story? I say Les Mis. I say Jean Valjean. You say Jean Valjean, right? Who doesn't know the story? That's okay. It's okay. We got to know this because we got to work on it, right? So, okay. So those who don't know it, let me ask those who know it really well. Who has seen the movie a handful of times? Or oh, good, Randy in the back. Who knows the story pretty well? Could talk about the basic themes. No? Somebody else other than Randy? Kirsten's online to sing the musical. Okay. All right. Well, this is important to know because we're gonna start here. I'm actually going to show part of the movie. And I'm going to show the beginning part of the movie, but it's important to know what develops after in the movie and how the whole plot goes together. So first of all, let me tell you about this story and why it's so important. Next year, this will be the sesquicentennial of this book's advent, of this book's coming. 1862, this book was written and released by Victor Hugo. That's 150 years ago. And almost from the moment that this book hit the streets in Paris, in 1862, it was an instant bestseller. It was instantly a powerful story that the people in France got behind and liked, and it's been a powerful story in American culture as well. And so much so in American culture that there are 6 movie versions of this story. 6. The first movie version was in 1909, and it was the first full-length movie that was ever made in Hollywood. That's pretty. When I read that, I was really kind of blown away. I've always loved this story. I read this book in junior high, and it always stuck with me. But this story, since the moment it hit the streets, has been popular beyond belief. Now, the movie version we're going to use is not the 100-year-old version, I want you to know. It is about a 20-year-old version, the last movie made in America with Liam Neeson and Jeffrey Rush and a few others. Cameron Diaz is in it as well, but she has we won't show her part. It's a great movie, well acted. But the story is what is significant here. And the power of this story from the moment it came out is always, the more I've read about it, it's actually overwhelming. Now you got to understand this. Does anybody to speak good French enough to know what Les Mis, yes, good. What Les Misérables means? Does anybody know what that means? You do? Is that a yes? Please tell. The suffering. Right, that's good. It can be translated a few different ways. The actual title of this book is like the poor folk, the wretched, the forgotten. This book, written 150 years ago, was about poor people. And that's one reason that the people who bought it first and got excited about it were the poorest of the poor in Paris, in France, in this period. And what Victor Hugo was trying to do was to write a book about people and lift up their stories and lift up the plight of so many folks who are in this economic position. So that in and of itself is unusual. I mean, you can't imagine much of that happening today, I don't think. You imagine the book, a sensationalized novel coming out about the poor and it being a bestseller instantly. Other than John Grisham, I can't imagine it happening. So that sets the stage for this movie, for this story. Now, what about the plot? I want to need some help here. Guys, we're a small group. Don't disregard the camera. We're a small group. I'd much rather have an interaction. This is the way I like to work. So those who've seen the movie or read the book or know the story, again, I need your help. Who said they knew it pretty well? Well, just jump. Okay, you guys are not helping here. Who is Jean Valjean? Does somebody want to start with someone? Jean Valjean. Vincent Price. That's one of the 6 I'm not talking about in the movie versions. Okay, so nobody's going to help me here? Jean Valjean, the story in the movie version starts with him getting out of prison. He is a guy who just spent 19 years in prison. And this is in the beginning of the story. Basically, he goes to prison in 1830s France. So a really difficult time in French history. So he goes to prison. And does anybody know why he goes to prison?
Stole a loaf of bread.
All right, he stole a loaf of bread. He stole a loaf of bread to feed his family, actually his sister's family. That's right. And he spends 19 years in prison. And so the story that we're going to watch starts with him getting out of prison. Does anybody know what leads to his transformation? I'm going to just help here. We're going to watch part of this, but come on, give people. This is for the people who have not seen the movie or know the story, because we're not going to fill in all the gaps. We've got to do part of that right now. Right? You with me? So Jean Valjean gets out of prison, 19 years, and what happens? Randy, you're on this. Where's my French scholar in the back? An act of compassion. Phil changes his life. So what happens, right? And we're going to see that act of compassion. But what happens thereafter? What happens to Jean Valjean?
He becomes a person. He's he helps I don't know how he
That's great. You're doing great. I wish you had name tags.
He helps this lady, tries to help her initially. If I'm remembering correctly, something happens with her child. He finds out where the child is and what her plight has happened to the mother of the child. And he goes and gets the child and takes her in and raises her and gives her the life that he couldn't help other people with, and et cetera, et cetera.
Wow, that's good. That's good. So that's great. So you get the child, his name was Cosette, and again, my French scholar in the back, I was like, the name Cosette, and I studied actually French for a long time, or French history mainly, and Cosette in France, that name, I don't know there's an American equivalent, but maybe Abraham Lincoln will be sort of close. I mean, something incredibly symbolic of, just a person. I don't know what's close to Cosette for America, but in French culture, Cosette is a powerful name because what she represents, the hope, somebody who is an orphan, who is a bastard child, who is left to the worst conditions, but Jean Valjean essentially, takes her on, saves her, raises her as her own, and she becomes, her story alone is just full of hope for the future. And that idea, I don't know, maybe, I don't know what a good American version of that story is, but it means a lot in French culture. So good, that's Cosette. So anybody else want to fill in? What else about Jean Valjean makes him significant or different? Or part of his story. I'm going to add this. He goes from having nothing, getting out of prison with nothing, to having a lot. Does anybody remember that part of the story? Okay, nobody's helping me? Okay. So part of the story that we won't show on the movie, so this is important to know, about, again, how this act of compassion, if you will, changes not only the life of this man and the lives of so many people like Cosette and her mother, and Javert, the cop who chases him throughout the story. But there's also a whole community of people that are changed because of Jean Valjean's change. And Jean Valjean, goes to a town, essentially after the scene we'll see, and he becomes a laborer in a factory. And the factory essentially is on the verge of closing down. And he sort of sees a way of making things easier, a little tweak in the process. And that tweak in the process, not only does it work, the factory becomes very successful. He becomes the owner of the factory. He then becomes mayor of the town. And all this, by the way, under an assumed name. Not his real name. And he becomes very prominent, right? He becomes wealthy. He becomes the highest official in this small town in France. So and he brings with him essentially this bomb of prosperity. This change that emanates from him starts to affect rungs and rungs of folks all throughout. So do y'all remember that part of the story? For those who know the story versus those who don't, what have I left out so people have a sense? I mean, I have some people who know the story, so that those who don't know enough, have never heard of Jean Valjean, what else do we need to fill in? What else do we need to fill in about Javert? And we'll see the bishop in a minute. I'll talk about him in a minute. Anything else? We're okay? Okay, so you all got the basic idea. So here's what I want to talk about, is that I want to talk about that I think this story, and even the first part of the story, presents what I like to think of as three different images of justice, three different visions of justice, three different ways in which justice plays out or doesn't play out on an everyday basis, or in the court system, in the prison system, etc. And the first position I would suggest that we're going to see is an idea of retributive justice. Does anybody know what retributive justice is? What does that mean? And the second one is restorative justice, and lastly I'm going to ask, what kind of justice do we have today? So what is retributive justice? Hey, anybody have an idea of retributive justice? Guys, we're a small group. An eye for an eye. Good, Pat, thanks. An eye for an eye. I mean, you harm me, I'm going to harm you back. That's retributive justice. And essentially, that's the kind of justice that Jean Valjean has, and it affects him. I mean, that's the kind of justice he experiences, right? He goes to prison for essentially what ends up being 19 years for stealing a loaf of bread, right? You took something, we're going to get you back. And so that's good. Now, does anybody have a sense of what restorative justice is? Sharon, come on, Sharon. I know you know, because we. So before, just give a quick. How do you tell folks what restorative justice is?
Balance and restorative justice is when you look at the consequence and try to weigh out equally, no apex of the triangle being more weightier than the other, but try to respond to an action with accountability, community safety, and competency restoration.
Oh, that's great. I'm not going to restate. Excellent job. So it's a whole other way, and we're going to talk about this because I'm going to suggest to you that the bishop, what happens with the bishop, is a restorative justice model, or what he does with Jean Valjean. So with that, and then I think we're going to talk about justice today, and that's sort of the framework we're going to sort of be moving through. You with me? I want you all to have more caffeine. That's what I need for you. All right. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to start the movie, and then actually, and again, the movie version. And I'm sorry about the logistics here. If I want to start playing, I got to jump to the first. The movie version doesn't show you the incredible depth of who the bishop is. And what I love about the bishop is we're getting this teed up. If the scene we're going to see is Jean Valjean just gets out of prison, and he walks into a town and he's trying to find a place to stay. He has no money, and he's supposed to report on parole because he's on parole. Happens today every day. So, and then he ends up going to the bishop's house. And the bishop, as we are supposed to say, the bishop was a very wealthy guy in his life before he became a bishop. A very wealthy guy. His whole family was wealthy. In fact, his cohort in the movie is his sister who lives with them and helps maintain the house. And the only vestige he kept from his wealthy past, and he gave it all up intentionally, the only vestige of his past was the silverware he had. And he kept it. It had his family's name on it. It was like, this is the one part. This is who we were. But he's conscious in giving up his wealth because he's a man of the cloth. He's a man of service, and so that's the significance of this silver that becomes really important in this movie. Right, Pat? That's right. All right. So I'm going to try to fast forward this. Okay. Let's see if I can get there really fast. I think so. Here we go. Okay. This is it.
You can't sleep here.
Get away from me.
Why don't you go to an inn?
What do you think?
Did you knock on doors and ask people?
I asked. I asked everywhere. Leave me alone.
You didn't ask there. Knock on that door.
Who can that be? Do you have any food you can spare for me?
Come in.
Look, I'm a convict. My name is Jean Valjean. I've served 19 years hard labor. They let me out 4 days ago. I'm on parole. I have to go all the way to Dijon to report by Monday, or they'll send me back to prison. So here's my passport. I can't read, but I know what it says. He's very dangerous.
Monsieur, you're welcome to eat with us as my guest.
I'm a convict. You saw my passport.
I know who you are.
You're gonna let me inside your house?
What crime did you commit?
Maybe I killed someone. How do you know I'm not going to murder you?
How do you know I'm not going to murder you?
What's that? A joke?
I suppose we'll have to trust each other.
I didn't kill anyone. I'm a thief. I stole food. I stole, but I paid for it. 19 years in chains. So they let me out and they give me a yellow passport. What can I do with a yellow passport? I have to go to my parole officer in Dijon, and then what? Starve to death? 19 years. And now the real punishment begins.
Men can be unjust.
Men, not God. All right, whoever you are, thank you. A meal and a bed to sleep in. A real bed. And in the morning, I'll be a new man.
Is anybody there? So we'll use wooden spoons. I don't want to hear anything more about it.
I'm sorry to disturb you,
Caught him.
but I had my eye on this man. And
Thank God. I'm very angry with you, Jean Valjean.
what happened to your eye, Monseigneur?
Didn't he tell you he was our guest last night?
Oh, yes. After we searched his knapsack and found all this silver, he claimed that you gave it to him.
Yes. Of course I gave him the silverware. But why didn't you take the candlesticks? That was very foolish. Madame Gillot, fetch the silver candlesticks. They're worth at least 2,000 francs. Why did you leave them? Hurry. Monsieur Valjean has to get going. He's lost a lot of time. Did you forget to take them?
Are you saying he told us the truth?
Of course. Thank you for bringing him back. I'm very relieved.
Release him.
You're really letting me go?
Didn't you understand the bishop?
Madame Gillot, Offer these men some wine. They must be thirsty.
Thank you.
And don't forget. Don't ever forget. You've promised to become a new man.
Promise? Why are you doing this?
Jean Valjean, my brother, you no longer belong to evil. With this silver, I bought your soul. I've ransomed you from fear and hatred. And now I give you back to God.
All right, so sometimes I like to stop this after the first scene, but let's just talk about what happens here. Jean Valjean, the guy's been in prison for 19 years, gets out of prison, and you saw the idea that he's got this passport that labels him differently. Well, if you all know, in Georgia there was a bill introduced this year that said everybody who's been convicted of a crime, of a felon, it should be on their driver's license. Right? So I want to see one other thought here as we go through this. How different is 150 years ago France to today in Georgia? We'll talk about that. Not that much. We need our own Victor Hugo. We'll get to that. So he gets out of prison, right? And he has this incredible act of grace and that's given to him, right? And he comes into the house and he's led, but he steals from this guy. Now, does it shock anybody? No. Because this guy's understanding him. Let's face it. This guy, the way society has dealt with him is to say, you took I'm going to take what I can get where I can get it because you took it from me, right? And in a way, he's sort of responding to this notion of retributive justice because he's been really a victim of that, right? And so when he steals and he knocks the bishop down, and I think in the book, I don't think he knocks him down. I think it was a non-violent felony, actually. But, the criminal defense lawyer in me, that's what I think I remember. Isn't that true, officer? Isn't one version before? No, I'm just joking. But then, of course, so that's the idea. Let me just say that this idea, first of all, that his plight, my favorite lines in this first part is Jean Valjean says, now the real punishment begins. He says, I got out of prison, I got this yellow passport, I'm marked for life, nobody's going to harm me, I can't get a place to stay, I don't have any money, what's the point, right? And he holds it up, and that very notion, when this book came out 150 years ago in France, some people, some political folk, some lord, somebody, were writing to Victor Hugo in the paper saying, so what's wrong with that? Come on, that's the way it is. That's the way we do it here in France. Once you've been a criminal, we're not going to give you any breaks. So what if it's stuff on you? Shouldn't have stolen a loaf of bread. Even that idea, created a response from the power structure then. Not that different maybe than what happens sometimes today. So the paradigm, I think, that's going on for him is this idea of eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. You harm me, I'm going to harm you. It's that simple. And Dr. King said it best, if we live by that adage, if we all do an eye for an eye, then we'll all be blind, right? Because nobody has not sinned. Nobody has not transgressed. We all have done something wrong, and we'd all end up lame and blind and without limbs if we just kept taking body parts every time we did something wrong. So that's retributive justice. Now, what about the bishop? What happens with the bishop? And let me suggest to you that this is a notion of restorative justice. Because what the bishop does is he reclaims the power of what happened between them, right? Because normally, and I like to, Pat seen me do this once, but it's Christians, in fact, take your pen, right? And this is, I take your pen, I walk out of here, and this is Emory, so there's probably a couple guards at every door, right? But there's a guard, and I take something more valuable. I take her pad, I take her computer. I start walking out, and sure enough, downstairs, before I get in my car in the parking deck, somebody sees me and says, "You stole that computer." I'm like, "Well, they got me, right?" So they catch me. Now, what happens to me when I take her stuff? When the police are there, what happens to me? Get arrested, right? So lawyers, criminal defense lawyers, Carla, help me out here. So I go to court, I get in jail, whether I get out on bond. Sometime I end up in front of a judge, whether it's an arraignment or a counter call, depending on jurisdiction and how that particular thing is where at some point I'm standing before a judge and a prosecutor and hopefully a lawyer that talked to me for a few minutes before, God willing. And what happens, right? Is she called into court ever to talk? Is she ever forced or encouraged or allowed to engage me as to what happened to her computer? And she got her computer back, by the way, because they gave it, they caught me downstairs, they gave it right back to you. So what happens to me? Come on, you're all lawyers. Come on, what happens? What's that? I'm sentenced. I plead guilty. Yeah, they got me. I ain't got no defense unless I'm crazy, and I am crazy, but that's not a defense, right? So I'm going. So what happens to me? I pay my debt to whom? Society, right? So what happens? What kind of debt? Now, I've got lawyers here. What kind of probation? I've never been in trouble before, right? I get probation, right? Do I pay a fine? How much time on paper would I have? 2 years? 5 years? 10 years? Right? It's been in the jurisdiction. That's right. That's right. It depends on the jurisdiction. So now I have been convicted of a crime, rightfully so. I took something, and I'm paying the state back every month by going to probation, by paying fines, by paying fees. And what happens to her? Is she involved in this process? No. Not at all. Now, how many of you know that happens every day in court, right? Every day, right? So restorative justice basically says, wait a second. So restorative justice basically triangulates what is a bilateral conversation. A bilateral engagement becomes a triangulation, right? Because now I've harmed her, and albeit I might have harmed the community too. That's part of restorative justice notion. But I've harmed her. But who am I paying back? Who do I answer to? I answer to this entity over here, the state, the government, and she's left out of the equation. And my relationship to her is left out of the equation. My relationship to the community and what I've done to you all by upsetting the balance is left out of the equation, right? So. Do you all know how old this concept is? I mean, how long do you think this idea that I have to pay the state back for something I've done to her, how long has that been in American jurisprudence? Or English jurisprudence? Or jurisprudence at all? How far do you think it goes back?
Since day one.
Since day one? Well, sadly, I'm not that much of a pessimist. No, it's not true. Anybody want to guess before I educate you? It goes back to William the Conqueror, 1066. And it goes back 1,000 years. And you're lawyers, and you know that 1066 is not that long when it comes to jurisprudential principles, right? It's not that long, right? Because we studied property, all that craziness of property law. Forgive me, property professors, but the law is ancient, right? So 1,000 years ago, this idea that if I take her computer and walk out and they catch me, that I've got to pay the state, that's 1,000 years old in English jurisprudence. And what happened is, William the Conqueror, who took over England, the last king to come from outside to invade, took over and he said, I'm the new king, guys. But all these local fiefdoms, all these local guys weren't giving him his props. They were not giving him his respect. And he couldn't figure. He kept trying things. He says, I'm the king. I kicked your all's butt. I'm the guy. And they're like, nah, you're not the guy yet. So he kept trying to find ways. And so what he did, the last big ditch effort he did to make sure that he got the respect he needed and wanted, was to say, before, if I took her computer, I had to answer to her. I had to answer to the community. The tribe or the people might decide, the community say, well, Doug, you've stolen from her. And like it's in the Bible, they say, you've stolen one computer, you've got to give 2 back. I stole a computer, you've got to give 2 back, and you've got to give her a sheep too. Right? Y'all know that. This idea of restorative justice, by the way, is ancient. It's in every culture. It's in every indigenous culture. Everybody's got it. But William the Conqueror started to change that. And he said, well, no, maybe because what he did is that if I have to pay the state for my crime, then he gets power. Right? And he's taken the power from this relationship and the relationship we had together as a community to my relationship with the state in this autonomous, detached, isolated sort of way. You with me? So restorative justice is all about coming back to this relationship. Now, with that in mind, what does the bishop do here? The bishop reclaims that power. The bishop takes that power back and he says, no, this is about my harm. And I'm the one who has the power to decide what happens to it. Not the police. I could give my power away. Right? And this could happen, by the way, and this notion of what the bishop does is not, it's ancient. It's not new. It's ancient. It's older than the idea that I got to be on probation for 2 years and see a probation officer and pay a fine or go to prison. And for those of you, I am a Christian, but if you're even just as an old document, if you just read the Bible, even murder cases, right? People that, murder cases, man, they got to go. No, read the Bible. And murder, if I killed her brother, she might say, I can eat 5 sheep this time. And she gets to decide. Because that brother was a little less scoundrel. I mean, and maybe it's 10 sheep. He was a little better than the first brother. I mean, whatever. The point is that even violent crime is defined in terms of relationship to each other, not in terms of our relations with the state. You with me? So when I think about restorative justice, in my understanding, in my reading, in our practice of it, in our work, in our office, is that's what restorative justice is. What I love about this movie and this story is that almost from the beginning, it sets a different paradigm of how to think about justice. It says, maybe the bishop wasn't so crazy. And maybe he's modeling something that's much bigger than how I want to engage the world, but how the world should engage each other. You with me? Now, and I'm going to do a couple things before we move on to this idea of what other kinds of justice are, but let's not forget what happens from this. I know this is a story, but stories, we live by stories in this culture. More and more the stories are on the screen. So we enter into a dark room with a bunch of people we don't know, and we pay $10 and we eat bad popcorn, and the stories that we live by and resonate in our hearts are more and more coming from places like this. Now, of course, I'm saying so. The power of a story, you might say, Doug, this is just a story. Yeah, it's just a story. But isn't that much of what all we live by? I mean, that's whether it's in our faith, in our practice, in our lives. So in the story, after the bishop does this, the transformation of Jean Valjean is not immediate. He doesn't instantly become an amazing cat, right? In fact, so much so that on his way, he hasn't decided what he's going to do yet, and he leaves this town, and he's on his way to Dijon, which is where he's supposed to be. And he never makes it, by the way. But on his way, somebody else does something to him, and he's about ready to kill the guy. He's about ready to take him out because the guy he disrespected him. And he's like, and he does something, and he backs up and says, wait. And he hurts the guy, but he says, wait, okay, this is not, I am evolving to another person. But this evolution of Jean Valjean takes place slowly, but it takes place in large part in the story because of what happens with this act of grace. Now, did the bishop have to do what he did? Come on, right? No. He could have done whatever. He could have, he didn't have to do this. And so the momentum that the bishop creates in Jean Valjean's life starts a seed, and that seed starts to grow. And again, I want to remind you of all the powerful things that happens in this story because of that seed. It's not just this town that he essentially saves. He saves the jobs for all these workers. It's not just this woman who has an illegitimate child who he takes in and agrees to raise her, and he takes her on his own. It's not just people he saves along the way and this powerful influence in the community. It's even the person who is chasing him his entire life, his entire adult life. There's a guy in the movie, and again in the story, a guy named Javert. Javert is a cop. And now remember, Jean Valjean never reports on parole, so there's a warrant, right? Again, I'm a criminal defense lawyer. There's a warrant out for this guy. And he's using a false identity. And Javert, who had been in prison, that was the scene where Jeffrey Rush sort of looks over at him in the prison. And he shows up later in the scene, in the movie, in the story, where he comes to the town where Jean Valjean is the mayor, and Javert sees him and says, I think I know that guy. In fact, what triggers him is one time when there's a cart that has been spilled, and a guy is underneath, this old man is underneath, who's one of his workers in his factory, and Jean Valjean just gets down and lifts the thing up, like it's sort of a Herculean, sort of strength beyond belief. And and then Javert says, wait, I only know one guy who was ever that strong. And he was in prison, and I knew him. And I think that's the guy. And from then on, Javert says, that's the guy. You were supposed to report on parole. You never reported. I'm coming after you. Which is a whole other part of this movie, right? So again, this impact that Jean Valjean has, first in the people he's around, Cosette, the mother, these people he saves, and then eventually for Javert. Because Javert is after him. And Javert, if I suggest to you, represents another paradigm of the law. It represents the law. You did wrong, you're going to pay. The law says this, we're done, right? I mean, anybody in here a former prosecutor before I make fun of prosecutors? No, you know what I'm saying? I mean, it's a classic, look, you did it, we're done, right? You did the crime, we're done. That's Javert. No room, no gray, it's black, it's white, it's done. You with me? So Javert even comes to this place, so Jean Valjean's transformation is so deep, it's so deep, that he saves Javert's life later in the movie. And he saves his life, and then he says, look, I know you've been chasing me for the last 20 years. And listen, I just want to take this kid home, well, another kid I saved, and I'm coming back, and you can take me back to prison. And Javert sits on the bank of the River Seine, and he says, and he just can't imagine. He reaches this place, he says, I have no way of reconciling this world, because here I am acting like the law I'm supposed to be, And this guy, and I'm supposed to take this guy back to prison, and yet he saved my life, and he's saving these other people, and he's willing to come back and go to prison. And so Jean Valjean comes back. You know the story, right? Those who don't know the story, this is another part of the story is Jean Valjean comes back, and Javert can't make sense of his life at that point and commits suicide. That's deep. That's deep, that this notion that law is, there's no room for gray. It's black or it's white. It's up or it's down. You did it or you didn't. And here are the sentencing structure. And here's the guidelines. God bless the sentencing guidelines of 1989. I mean, there's no room. We're done. And he says, that is not the world I now live in. And I have no way of understanding the world I live in. So he jumps in the river and kills himself. Now, all I'm saying is that too is an impact of these seeds of grace. Is this level of which Jean Valjean changes impacts people throughout this continuum, even people that are chasing. Right? You with me? So that's just setting it up. Let me look over and see when we're going to take a break. Before now, how are we doing? Because we're doing okay. All right. So now the question is, folks, what kind of system do we have today? So I've given you a couple different ideas. There's retributive justice. There's restorative justice. There's the Javert. There's the law on the law, and ain't nothing else in between. Rose is a rose. Gertrude Stein, I don't know. Right? But it's clear, no gray. Well, what kind of system do we have today? Combination? Talk to me now. You've been helpful. See, she's been helpful. I like her. She's been helpful. So talk to me. That's good.
I say it's a combination because...
Recording gurus.
I say it's a combination because when it comes to certain crimes and evidence and all that kind of stuff, I'm not a lawyer, first of all. I'm a guardian ad litem. Okay. Lay guardian ad litem, as they refer to us. Talk about their attorneys. But there are certain crimes that once the evidence is clear and concise, it's like it's black and white. It's you did it. This is the evidence that shows you did it. You go in jail, kind of thing. The eye for an eye, I think Georgia has a law where if someone comes on your property or you think you're in harm's way and they're on your property and you feel like they're going to harm you in some way, you have the right, just shoot them.
That's right. That's right.
Okay. And as far as restorative justice, I work in the juvenile court, so I know with the juvenile court, even on the delinquent side, a lot of times we try to do community service and, things to pay back to the community as part of their probation orders and things of that nature. So that's a little bit of the restorative. And restitution is also ordered.
Right. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yes, ma'am. My French scholar in Greek.
I would say it's selective justice. If you are in fact brought to trial or brought before the court, there may be some parity, but the circumstances, who you are, the resources you have available, I mean, even what cases are brought, there's clearly a disconnect there. And not only does that keep you disconnected from the victim, but since now the case belongs to the state, the victim really has very little control over that. So the district attorney's office really controls what cases are even brought to a tribunal. So the state, I think, has total control. So I wouldn't say it's restorative. I'd say it's selective.
Selective. Interesting. All right. Thanks. Carla, did you want to?
Well, I just been thinking about that question, Doug, because, there are so many variables involved. It's hard to answer that question. On the one hand, there's a lot of talk about restorative justice, but on the other hand, in practice, it's very much still, retributive. And, depending on who's in power, we see that ebb and flow. In addition, no matter what kind of justice, is prevalent, there's still the arbitrariness of race and class and economics. So it's hard to say, one way or another, which one is really in effect. But I will say something with regards to, the victims. There is and has been a movement to include the victims more in the process. But from a standpoint of not really Well, there is, to some extent, some effort to include them in making a determination as to how a particular crime might be presented or prosecuted. Very little of that. You know, there are some times when they do seek the victim's input on that. We see it more on the other end with regards to the outcome, you know, in sentencing. There's more opportunities, I think, now for victims to have some say in, you know, what kind of sentence, you know, is under consideration. But that is not from, there's no effort on that part for the victims to be addressed from a restorative standpoint. It's more input from the victims as to, you know, retributive standpoint.
That's a great point. I mean, this is all good. It's all good. And I would say too that even including victims and restitution and all that are sort of these pieces that sort of float back into the restorative model, or retributive model. But essentially, it's still retributive. It's sort of kind of grab these pieces. Oh, well, we do restitution. Well, who has the power? Well, the cops got the power. The DA, the judge got the power. You know, well, we do. You know, we ask the victim what happened. Well, we've had cases all the time where we've gotten the victims. You know, they say I want the second outcome, but still the judge has the power, not the victim. And the prosecutor has the power. So, well, let me pose it this way. So I'm going to spin this into a broader context. So today in America, there are over. Well, let me talk about Georgia first. Do you know how many people are in Georgia in the prison system? You have any idea? A lot. A lot. There's roughly 54,000. 54,000 folks in prison. How many people are there? And you all know where, you know, Georgia is one of the highest ranking per capita for the country. So does anybody know where the country is vis-a-vis the rest of the world? How does America rank with regard to incarceration? What's that? Way up there. Way up there. That's good. That's a good start. Yeah. No. First, we got, that's right. We're number one. America's number one. And in America now incarcerates about 710 people per 100,000 in America. That's Georgia's about 986 people per 100,000. Thankfully, we don't lead the country. Does anybody know what state does lead the country for the highest incarceration rate? Texas. Not Texas, but close. In between. Louisiana at 1,200 people per 100,000. Louisiana leads the, now understand this, and the South leads the country, and the country leads the world with its rate of incarceration. So now, I want to ask you, who's in prison? Are violent offenders in prison mainly? Y'all saw these reports out lately, right? It's all been hitting the news, just like that song. It's all been hitting the news lately, right? About who's in prison. Does anybody know the ratio of violent versus nonviolent offenders in prison? 3/4. I got my plant like Randy in the back. So what did you say, Randy?
3/4 nonviolent.
That's basically right. I usually go up a little bit. Most of the numbers are right around 80%, 75 to 80%. 75% to 80% are nonviolent offenders. And like Jean Valjean, he was a nonviolent offender. He spends all these years in prison. Let me just give you a perspective real quick. If you go back 25 years in Georgia history or American history, what was the percentage then? And in particular, 1985. I'll pick 1985. And most of the criminologists all go back to 85. They go back to 83. But why? First of all, what was the percentage then in 85?
Higher, probably 90%.
90%.
Drug crimes.
What's that?
Drug crimes.
In 85.
Yeah. Oh no.
No, it's the opposite. It's the opposite. And so in the mid 80s, before the craziness in the prison population boom in this country, the percentages were exactly flipped. So 80% of folks in prison were there for violent offenses, 20% for nonviolent. So for 25 years, and we've had this incredible escalation of the criminal justice system, both in terms of sentencing and in terms of more crimes, et cetera, right? So let me give you perspective. In 1985, I told you how many people are in prison today in Georgia. How many people are in prison in Georgia in 1985? You guess? 30, 25? Anybody? Do we have any real pessimists here? Because you're all optimists. I don't know. 8,000 people. And that increase of anywhere, most of the numbers around the country are 400%, 450% increase in the prison population in the last 25 years. And all the numbers are pretty consistent around this. So So what we've done in this country, we talk about what kind of model we have. This is what I want to say. What kind of model do we have? Because we're incarcerating mainly nonviolent offenders. We've gone up 450% in the raw number and then the cost, right? Do you all know where the prison system in Georgia ranks in its cost for the state? I mean, the first being whatever, second or eighth, or what is it 20th or is it second? What do you think it is? Top 5? You got number 2. We're close. It's number 3. Right behind, I think, healthcare and education, or transportation. Transportation. Number 3, $1.2 billion in Georgia alone to keep 54,000 folks in prison. That's not parole, that's not probation, that's not, that's a whole other story. I mean, this is just prison walls. And this isn't the cost for building prisons either. It's just to maintain the prisons we got. So in 25 years, we've escalated from, in this state alone, from 8,000 folks to 54,000 folks, nonviolent or violent offenders mainly in prison to mainly nonviolent offenders. And this pattern is consistent around the country, incredibly consistent. Now, I can tell most of the folks in here will probably know what I'm going to ask you with this. You should be able to answer me because you're not, because you probably know. What happened around the mid-'80s to make this happen? Reagan, I love that. That's right. That's right. That's right. War on drugs. What else? I heard some others. I'm sorry. That wasn't until the 90s mostly, but you're right. That was actually what happened in the mid-'80s to start this precipitous increase in the prison population and in these mandatory minimums and et cetera, et cetera. What's that?
They prioritized prison system.
The privatized. That actually didn't happen until the early 90s. So that was a result of this whole growth. So here's all I'm saying: is many of these things are right, and somebody said Reagan, and Michelle Alexander in her book exactly called a New Jim Crow, the New Jim Crow, says exactly that. She has this great point that I love, and she says Reagan declared a war on crime in 1982, and there wasn't a crime epidemic. He decided there was about to be. I mean, that's what she intimates that before there was really the data to support it. He's like, we got to start building up the police and the cops and the jails and the prisons because there's a lot of data to support that. But a lot of folks actually go back. If you remember, if you were around in the mid 80s, in the early 80s, something hit the streets of America that scared the bejesus out of most everybody, and that was crack cocaine. Crack cocaine changed the landscape of urban America, and people are crying out for the government, do something. You got to do something, right? Well, they did something. The war on crime, the war on drugs, mandatory minimums. By 1989, the feds had passed. They removed discretion from the federal sentencing guidelines, and a judge had no power to decide what to happen because the Congress shut it down. Y'all know that. Y'all know these stories. And it started happening around the country. So what happened in the mid-'80s was this major movement to folks essentially like Jean Valjean. I mean, Jean Valjean would be spending a lot of time in prison based on today. Maybe not before 85, but certainly today.
Doug, crack, was it because it was cheap or because of the drug effect on people?
There's a lot of debate. Well, I mean, I just want to say that was the real sort of catalytic moment, if you will. I mean, I remember stuff happening. There was testimonies in Congress in Washington in 85 and 86 and 87 because poor communities were being devastated. I mean, the violence had risen dramatically in the 80s because of crack. Crack was cheap. Crack was much more addictive than cocaine, than straight cocaine, at least allegedly. And it created this, a huge underground economic movement that got people bought into it, and it just devastated communities. Well, it's also, my friend, it's complicated. What I would say, I don't think it's that linear. I'm just saying it was a moment, it was a specific thing. The guy used to volunteer with us, who was the head for years of the psychology department at Morehouse, who's an addictionologist, the first addictionologist I ever met. I didn't even know there was such a thing. He worked with clients and cases with us. And he said, and he's written all about this stuff, and he said that the crack cocaine was the first drug in addictive drug history that had as many women as men addicted to it. Another point that makes it more powerful. So what happened is drugs and alcohol often decimated poor communities in any community, but when crack hit, and it hit the poor neighborhoods, it hit women as much as it hit men, and that was phenomenal. That had not happened.
But it also brought stoners.
It's true too. Well, what do you mean?
White collar worker.
Yeah.
Men in the business suits.
That's right.
Doing crack cocaine.
That's right. That's right.
Got caught using crack cocaine.
That's right. Yeah. Are you from D.C.? Come on.
No.
You're not a Mary. All right. That's right. It's multi-layered, but that is what a lot of folks point to, and it's what a lot of folks gave the eagess, if you will, to the government to do something about it. And that's what they did. So they created this. So now, so I'm asking you, first of all, and let me just do one more thing up here, because this is really what I want to sort of really talk about towards the end here, is so we create this momentum. We're on drugs, we're on crime, mass incarceration, mandatory minimums, 3 strikes you're out, 2 strikes you're out, and what are some of the other consequences? And one of the consequences that our office deals a lot with are the civil consequences, the collateral consequences of a criminal arrest or conviction. Let me put this in perspective for you. Georgia ranks the second worst in the country of creating barriers for folks who have an arrest or conviction on the record. Civil barriers for, fill in the blank, housing, jobs, licensure, schooling, to name a few. Military is a federal issue. So now we started this momentum, and as part of this momentum, we start adding on additional consequences. It's not just that you got a record. It's not just you went to prison or not. Not just that I had to, pay a probation officer or whatever. Now, after I've completed my term or whatever, I get out, or I just got arrested and I try to apply for that job, and now that job I can't get that job. I can't get into housing, right? And Mary back here, where's Mary? Mary was here. Everybody who works in legal aid knows this issue, that if you're dealing with services for poor folk, that having an arrest, not just a conviction, will stop you from getting that thing, that benefit. So let me put this in perspective, too, for how deep this is. So I was recently, even in the last 4 years, this has changed dramatically. So there's a recent survey the National Employment Law Project did on all employers, big bunch of employers. And today, over 70 to 75% of employers do a background check before they hire somebody. That is up almost double in less than 3 years. So now I'm going to put this in. So you got these barriers, right? Georgia ranks the second worst in the country. And right along with that is you have employers who are now doing background checks more so than they did even 3 years ago. And the proliferation of information for folks who have something on the record is much easier to get. I was out of town recently, and I caught the train back to MARTA to get picked up by my wife, I think, and I saw the only ad I saw on the MARTA train. The only ad I saw was, want to know somebody's felony criminal background? Easy number. Call it up. We got it. So a lot of folks talk about, y'all know this, right? And how many have you all some of you are in positions of hiring, have used background check companies, right? Have you? Have you used background checks? You hire people? Use background checks? You can tell me. Tell me. You don't do background checks? Who's done a background check? Come on. Raise your hand. Okay, you've done a background check? You've done a background check? So have you used a private company when you've done it? You didn't use a private company? Well, there's smart people in this room. You use a private company? You went to the state, right? Which is a whole nother. So the other part about the National Employment Law Project's sort of research on this, it says not only are employers using more and more, are doing this more and more, they're using more and more private companies. And the rate of errors by private companies is almost double what you get if you just get this straight from the skinny, from the state. I was just in Washington at a meeting of a bunch of legal nonprofits around the country who are looking at this issue, and all this data they've compiled, we sort of knew some of this, but it's really pretty scary. So the collateral consequences of an arrest or conviction, and even in this state alone, a lot of folks think, let me ask you this, how many of you all think that just because you got arrested but not convicted, that it doesn't show up on your record? You all know this answer? You know what I'm talking about? So nobody here believes that just because I was arrested, that it won't show up on my record. In other words, you know that having an arrest alone will show up when somebody pulls your record, right? Everybody knows that? So how hard is it to get that off your record if you just got arrested but not convicted? Who knows about it? Somebody's done some.
Once you've been processed in and charges are brought, it can't be expunged.
That's, well, okay. How many, the folks, let's talk more about that, but that basic proposition that once you're charged and processed, which is, what do you mean by process, Pat?
I mean, booked in, charges have been brought against you, you posted a bond, but prior to going to trial.
Prior to going to trial. Well, that's in the law in Georgia. This is kind of tricky because the law in Georgia is a mess. The law in Georgia, we have expungement in this state. Y'all know what expungement means? Somebody recently, I was somewhere and they said, is that with an X or an E? I mean, X or an S? Expungement. I mean, the word on the street, everybody talks about expungement, but nobody really knows what it is or how it works. And Georgia has an expungement statute in Georgia. And some of the material I gave you, this larger handout, is a law that we've been working on and trying to change, going from what the law is today, which is this big graph of how complicated it is, Let me put this in perspective for how complicated it is. So Georgia doesn't allow for expungements. But first of all, you've got to apply for an expungement. And where do you apply? You apply to the arresting agency. How many arresting agencies are there in Georgia? 600. Is there a uniform process for that 600 to do an application? No. How much does it cost to apply for an expungement? $25. Well, actually, you get with it now. It's 50. It's 50. $50. How long does it take for an expungement application to go through the system? Is there a set time? Anybody read the statute lately? Everybody filed one and followed it? Come on, seriously, anybody done that? Because we do this all the time in our office. And we say it's a year to 2 years if you're lucky. And we're filing them as lawyers, filing expungement applications for people. Calling the clerk's office, calling the DAs, asking, will you sign it? Get it moving. So you've got a process that is complicated, it's onerous, it's expensive, and it's long, right? So let's assume that, yes, ma'am?
And is it discretionary?
Good question. Good question. What do you think?
Yeah.
Yeah? Let me put it this way. We were thinking about suing a county, which will remain nameless, who the DA's office in that county has decided they are not signing any expungement forms. None. But the law says that under these conditions and those conditions, and it's complicated, like I said, but that they are supposed to sign them at a certain point. And so has anybody brought suit against that county? Have you heard of this county being sued, or the DA's office being sued, or mandamus action? No, right? So is it discretionary? Basically, yeah. Because imagine you got somebody who is, who is usually poor. The criminal justice system is mainly a system of poverty, who now has been arrested, charged, hopefully not convicted, and says, I want it off my record. And they go through the process, and they put the paperwork in front of the right people, and they wait. And at some point, they get something back that says no. Or, most times they say no. So you can imagine that most times those folks have no recourse. They don't even know how to recourse to get involved, unless they have hired a lawyer, or maybe they come to us. But the point is that the answer is really yes. It's not supposed to be, but it often is. So there is a recourse. You can get stuff off your record in Georgia, but now let's take the example. Let's say it is discretionary, and it's one of the scenarios that somebody can get an expungement, and they get an expungement, right? So that person now, they've got arrested for drugs. My favorite example, and having done lots of these cases, 3 guys in a car, cops pull it over, my guy's in the back seat, drugs under the front passenger seat, and they arrest everybody, right? Right? You with me? Doesn't surprise anybody. Nobody's going, oh, that doesn't happen, right? It happened. Right? All 3 get arrested, right? And they go to jail, and, depending on what county you're in and how quick it is. And so at some point, those 3 guys show up in front of a judge and a prosecutor, and let's say they're all remaining mum, right? It's the driver's stuff, or it's the guy on the passenger side stuff. It's his stuff. And he ain't a stand-up guy. And he ain't saying, look, I got to let my buddies off, because I've had cases like that. I've had some stand-up co-defendants. I'll admit, that's cool. Where they say, I got to let my buddies, hey, that's not their drugs, it's mine. I'll take the fall. But a lot of times they're like, let's see how this goes. Let's see how this plays out. I don't care how it hurts my guys. And so they go in front of, and down the line, you get indicted, which once you're indicted, almost no chance of getting an expunged. You're standing before a judge, and finally the prosecutor, and in most of these systems, which are all underfunded and everybody's overworked, that nobody has a chance to look at this case. And finally, you all know this, we got a homicide case dismissed the other day because finally we got the prosecutor read the police report. 6 years later. Yeah, don't get me started. So I understand how busy it is. So finally, in front of you, it's usually a judge, and the prosecutor says, what are we doing? We're going to trial. There's a jury. Come on, what are we doing? And a DA finally picks it up. 3 guys under the passenger seat, looks at 3 guys and says, we're going after this guy. Cuts the other guys loose, right? So what happens to those 2 guys' records? And they get it expunged. They said they can get it expunged. When that guy goes to apply for a job, you hold up your hand, applies for a job with you, applies to become a foster parent. Now, how do you think... the vast majority of background checks are not done by the state through the state agency, through the GCIC, Georgia Crime Information Center. So if I applied for that guy's rap sheet through the GCIC, the official orifice of information for the state, it would not show up unless I was law enforcement, right? But if I'm an employer, I'm running some program, he might want to volunteer at the school with the school kids, or you name it, anything else, I'm going to a private company. And is that arrest showing up? Where there was a kilo or a bag of weed or whatever it was under the passenger seat when he got arrested? Absolutely. It's showing up. Is that guy going to be allowed to come to his kid's school on a school outing? Is that guy going to be allowed to go into housing, this Section 8? Is he going to be allowed? We've had this happen. We see folks being denied school, going to college because they got an arrest on the record. This isn't like scholarship school. This is just school. So my point is, even if there's an expungement, that guy who has not been guilty, who was never found guilty, who had an expungement, but a private company, what they do is they go gather all this information, different from how the GCIC does it, and they just proliferate it. You want to buy it? You want to buy it? You want to buy it? $5, $10? Buy it, please. I'm the guy. I'm on the train. Buy my information. Because my information is better than hers. Buy it. You want to know about the people coming to your organization. You want to know about the apartment complex that you're in charge of managing. You want to know about the program you run for after-school kids. And how do you get information? Companies, they're out there. It's $5. It's $10. I'll do it fine. And they bring it back to you. And has anybody, before I really go off it, how many of you have ever done that before? It's not bad. You're not wrong for doing it. I'm just asking, how many of you have gone to a private company to pull a background? You've done it, right? You've done it. And did anybody ever come back and say, this information is not right?
Sometimes you can just figure that out by looking at it.
Well, but you're an old criminal defense lawyer and you know how to do that. I mean, did you give a chance to the person to come back and say, what's your name, sir? Quentin. So Quentin, I got this rap sheet and it says you were in Missouri and got convicted of sexual molestation, which is a case we had once. And did you ever come back and say, Quentin's applied to volunteer with your program or for a job or for whatever, anything? Do you ever give him a chance? See, most times, the reality is if you've got something to offer, you don't do it. I ain't mad at you. It's just the way the world works. Employers go, hey, I saw something in Quentin's name, we're done. It said arrested, we're done. And we had a case recently where a guy was offered a job, and this is, because most people don't follow up. And most people don't come back. Quentin doesn't go back to Michelle and say, why didn't I get that job, Michelle? Would you tell me? And you say, well, Quentin, I really like you, and we're about to hire you, but look, I ran this rap sheet and it says you got this conviction in Missouri. And you're like, I can't even spell Missouri. I've never been to Missouri. But you've already made your decision, and now you've hired somebody else. We had a case recently where a guy had a job at Georgia Tech, and that was what happened. And he had a couple small things in Georgia, but they were small. And then he had this, sexual case from Missouri. He's like, I've never been to Missouri. And that information was provided through a private company. So one of the trends around the country, by the way, is to sue these private companies. I was at this gathering that Mary almost went to where the head of the EEOC brought 12 of her staff to this gathering to say, we recognize that this is a major problem. This bad information that's proliferating, of which there is very little recourse and has huge impact on people's lives. We had a forum down in Macon about a month ago, almost a month ago, where we had about 200 folks, and we have a lawyer of ours working in Macon at Mercer Law School. And we invited folks up just about this issue, just about the collateral consequences. And one of our speakers, who's one of our clients down there, she has 5 arrests on her record, no convictions. She's the mother of 2 or 3 kids. And her school, she cannot come to after-school programs. She cannot go on field trips. She cannot participate in her kids' education because of those arrests, not convictions that are on her record. Because the schools, whether it's Columbine or Virginia Tech or the insurance carrier, everybody's nervous. And real opportunities, not just for that person, but even for the next generation are being denied. And I was in Kentucky giving some talks. I heard that story over and over again in Louisville. That these are real things that happen to real people, often based on bad information, or even at best, information that somebody's not guilty. So the statute we proposed, we got asked by the legislature this past year to rewrite the expungement statute in Georgia, and we said we're going to make a clean line. We're going to say, look, no conviction means no record. End of story. Now, most people, I was with somebody from Roy Barnes' campaign, a good friend the other day, and he was trying to help us align with good liberal causes. And I said, wait a second, you don't understand. He said, actually, when we put out that position, you would not believe how many people, unlikely allies we had on that position at the State House and other places. And that folks say, wait, you mean you weren't convicted and it still will stop you from fill in the blank? And I'm like, yeah. I said, we got to change that. And so we saw this year that very conservative folk and we're willing to get behind that principle, to say that Georgia ought to be a place that if you've never been convicted of a crime, that when you apply for a job, you apply for housing, you apply to do something at your kid's school, you apply for whatever, that shouldn't show up. End of story. It's a clean line. Now, we're really excited. We didn't get our bill passed, but we got closer than we thought. We got through all the committees with unanimous votes, the Judiciary Committee. and we got caught in some stuff on crossover day, but the bill has been reintroduced again. We got it introduced 3 times this year. That seems like a record. I mean, 3 times we got our bill attached to another bill, and then it got introduced by a fairly prominent Republican who is all for this, who's from North Georgia, says this is the way it's got to be. Now, let me suggest to you, this is only the beginning for me and for us, because once I think that the state and as a community, we can say, if you've never been convicted, it should not stop you from getting a benefit. It should not stop you from filling the blank. But many states, including that incredible liberal bastion in South Carolina, have passed a law in the last year that says if you've been convicted of a nonviolent misdemeanor and you've been clean for 5 years, meaning no arrests and no convictions, it comes off. Automatically. I'm like, when South Carolina starts to make Georgia look that's making us look bad. And that takes a lot for South Carolina to make us look bad. I'm sorry, and then forgive me for South Carolinians and all those Louisiana people and everybody else I've offended, but that's amazing. So the point is that people all around the country are recognizing that the impacts of these laws are tremendous. 23 states in the last 3 years, according to the Washington Post, 23 states in the last 4 years have passed laws to increase the ability to vote, to expand the right to vote beyond a criminal conviction. Meaning, many states think, many places think, well, if you've been convicted, you can never vote. That's not the case, but it is the case for some places. And all these rules and regs, Georgia's rule, if you want to know, Georgia's rule is if you've been convicted and you're on paper, you know what that means on paper? You with me? Who knows what on paper means? Probation or parole. If you're on paper in Georgia, you cannot vote. But as soon as you're off paper, your right is restored. But is that done easily? Not necessarily. But the point is that Georgia allows that right. 23 other states in the country have recognized that we have been disenfranchising folk at a massive level, mainly folk of color, men of color, at a high degree that it's that everybody's worried, all these, one side is sort of worried about big lawsuits, which they should be. So 23 states have moved the bar up or down to bring in perspective, making it easier for the right to vote to happen just because you've been convicted. So what I'm suggesting to you is just in those couple examples, whether it's South Carolina or these 23 states that have changed the laws, is that this is an issue that's pervasive. And it goes back to what I talked about in 1985, is that we have built up a system that is massive, and it keeps rolling, and it's rolling hard. And a lot of folks never intended or saw the collateral consequences. The ABA has actually, just in the last year and a half, commissioned a study on this very issue. And they are putting together an entire approach that says, what are the collateral consequences of a criminal arrest or conviction in this country? And because they are recognizing that this is huge. And I suggest to you, my cynical side says a little bit that a lot of us in this work have known about this issue for a long time. But why is it now sort of rising up to what's the average person's concern? I suggest to you one of the reasons, and there are many, just like back to why crack was so bad, there are many, but one of the reasons is because the criminal justice system has taken some of their own. It has taken some of their own. Meaning, when we had a criminal justice system that just exclusively dealt with poor folks and folk of color in the inner city, we were all kind of fine with that. But I suggest to you that some people have told me that they believe that meth alone has changed the conversation about the impact of the criminal justice system. Yeah, Carmen.
The new expungement statute will be helpful to people who the new statute, if it passes, will be helpful to people who have no convictions. That's
Correct.
true. But when you talk about the numbers of people who are in jail, who are in prison now, who are coming out of jail, and who are still going to feel the collaborative effects, of having a criminal record, it's not going to help them. So, is there any, you talked about South Carolina, and if you're clean for 5 years, is there any movement in Georgia to address, maybe some people who've been out of jail for a long time and haven't committed any offenses and trying to clean their record up?
Well, 2 things real quick. One is that, let me paint the scope of the problem. Basically, a quarter of the state's population have a criminal record. There are 2.5 million criminal records in Georgia. There's roughly 10 million people. That doesn't count, I'm not even counting kids. If you think about adults, you're way off the chart in terms of percentages. Recently, the national average is up to about 20% of folks who have a criminal record in this country. We're talking about a lot of folks. Criminal record can mean conviction or arrest. So it could be either one, first of all. Our feeling about this, first of all, is that if we can't get folks to line up on a clear line, a goal, like a football analogy, there's a line, it's a clear line, it's a goal line. That's the line, and the line is no conviction. If I can't get people to on the same line and say this person has not been convicted of this case, therefore that should come off the record, we feel that's a beginning point. It's not the end point. But if I can't get people there, and we had a lot of debates with folks we were working with, collaborative partners, as we put the bill together this past year, about whether we should include pardons in that, whether we should include, like South Carolina did, and go beyond the conviction line. We want to go beyond the conviction line. And a lot of, in fact, Carla, what was encouraging to us is that a number of essentially fairly conservative legislators said, why aren't you going over the line? We need to do this. We were actually shocked. I had to convince my team was really worried about us drawing that line as clear as it was. Like, you just can't have no convictions fall off, all cases. I'm like, no, that's a clear. So we are encouraged because there's conversation exactly that. The state has recently put together this criminal justice commission that the Chief Justice, the Speaker of the House, and the governor are behind. And as you all probably know, that's a real Pew Center for the State's effort. And Adam Gelb, if you don't know him, is an Atlanta guy who's really behind all that. The Pew folk, the Pew Center for the State's Pew Charitable Trust out of Philadelphia. And Adam is a local guy who works for that and runs that whole initiative around the country. And that initiative has taken some hold in Georgia, such that a bill got passed this year that says we're going to look at all this. And the way Pew works is you've got to have the heads of the top branches of government, the three branches of government. And so that is going to be a conversation, because they're concerned about reducing the number of folks in prison and making it easier for folks who have a record to get along with their lives. So that's a conversation that's coming. But my feeling, and I'm glad if we want to have the line and go over it, but until we can get folks on the line, which we think we can, then we're really interested in going over it. So I hear you. So you want to take a break? All right, what are we doing? So break.
We'll take a 10-minute break and then come back.
Break. Ready, break. Football. Break. Okay, so I have about half an hour left or so. So I would, as you all can see, I can ramble on easily. God bless me, right? Don't let me do that. So I'd rather have a conversation or questions, because I know I want to drill it into, or hopefully make some connections to the world you all live in about how this issue affects you and how this civil consequence issue affects juvenile justice in the world you all live in. So I'll open up broadly, and then if I'd love to have some questions, or I'll ramble on, which I'm a trial lawyer. Right? Rob knows we ramble on.
Then just to pick up from our break, the effort to try to do the automatic expungement or whatever, but in that in-between time, giving employers some cover if they choose to step forward to try to give someone a break, this concept of negligent hiring. How are you all approaching that so that the employer gets a little bit of cover if they say, geez, this was just an arrest record, and you're telling me all this stuff, but I'm stuck with the paper, I want to hire you, and then something bad happens and it comes back and haunts the employer.
Right, so sort of unringing the bell sometimes is an issue. So having talked to a lot of civil lawyers about this and employers, they would, the hope is, first of all, if we can get the official state record, the law we've introduced would be that no convictions, no arrests that did not lead to convictions show up, right? So then an employer can, if an employer gets that information, which is, take my example of the guy arrested 3 times and no convictions, then there's nothing, then that guy does something wrong and the employer gets a civil suit against negligent hiring. Negligent for what? Problem often is, even if we get that law passed, that information of whether that person getting arrested 3 times is available back to the private people, right? Because what the folks like Choice Point do is they send their investigators down to the courthouses and they troll information from the jails, they troll information from the police. Now, I've been on the road a good bit lately and just different meetings and things, but in between being on the road, my college roommate asked me to go to the Masters with him. I'm not even a golfer. I don't understand it. I really don't understand it. But I said, he asked me to go, and I went. And we're, and as classic middle-aged guys whose kids, we went out at night to get a cup of tea, and we had to go to I'm serious, man, we're so boring, it's sad. And we get a cup of tea at the QT, right? And I brought my own tea bags. I am so bad, And on the counter at the QT in Augusta is a 50-cent piece of paper that I see on every counter of convenience stores in rural America everywhere. And you know what that is? It's last week's arrest. Y'all seen those? Yeah, come on now. You've seen them. I don't see them as much in the city. I see them in every small community I have been in around the country. So how does that information get there? They got, Sally and Billy and all mugshots from last week and got arrested. Well, that information, how do they, this isn't the GCIC. This isn't the official orifice of the state. This is like guys trolling information. And so now that employer, if he goes to the private companies and they troll that private information and they show that Billy got arrested 3 times, and by the way, we just loaded it in because we saw it when we were down at the Masters and bought a paper and stuck it in. I mean, there are companies that buy and sell that information every day. So the problem often is you've got 2 different vehicles of information. And people actually, even some of our friends at the State House now are realizing this. People in private business realize it. They're realizing that the official record could say one thing, like if you got first offender, under that question, first offender, and you completed it, and there's no record, right? It's not a conviction. You go to apply for a job. I can't say how many cases we have about this. And Sam goes to apply for a job, and the guy says, well, I'm not going to hire you. Why not? Well, you lied to me. What do you mean I lied? It said, were you convicted? He said, no. I said, that's right. I'm more than convicted. But they went to the private companies who trolled information who showed that they got, pulled the county records from the clerk's office, from the DA's office, from the jails, from the police, and it says you were arrested for drugs 3 years ago. And it shows this first, done, right? Official orifice, nothing. Private information, prolific. So this is a big issue. That's a deeper issue, even if you get the official line to be what the goal line I talked about. Some states, this is an issue that a lot of states are dealing with, people who work in this area. As I mentioned, we're sort of the only guys really doing this on a pretty large level. I mean, we're the only ones doing this in the state. Both direct service, meaning last year we had 600 clients alone we represented who had a criminal background, and it stopped them from getting something. And we're also doing stuff at the State House. I mean, there's only a handful of folks in the country really working on this, and we're the only ones. There's only like 2 or 3 of us in the Southeast that we know about. So what I'm saying is there's a growing awareness of that split and that issue of negligent hiring. But I think that there's a willingness to deal with it because it's a real issue. And I think it can be dealt with. So I'm sorry, I'm longer than that. Yes, ma'am?
But how can you deal with this private stuff?
That's a great question. So one of the ideas that's come up and I've heard is to limit liability, back to this other question, is to limit liability to only what's available officially, right? I mean, in other words, can you unring the bell? So one of the deeper, Carl was asking the next layer is what's behind the goal line to the 10-yard line to the 20 to the 30. One of these issues is regulating this private flow of information. Because the private flow of information, which is prolific, is having real detrimental consequences for folks. And it's pretty unregulated. So actually a lot of people around the country are using the Federal Fair Credit Reporting Act, FCRA they call it, FCRA, is sort of these big litigation issues to say, when you put out information and you say, I don't know if it's, back to my example, which happens all the time, it's Quentin Jones. It says Quentin Jones was arrested and charged in Missouri. It must be the same Quentin Jones. That now more lawsuits are coming against the private companies, the people who sell the information, and say, how much did you know that was the same Quentin Jones? Because you just now cost Quentin Jones a job, and you didn't validate the validity of that information. So there's ways in which lawsuits are coming against the private companies because they'll just put out information, boom, 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 boom.
Aren't too many Quentin Joneses who got denied a job who can afford an attorney
Exactly.
and a lawsuit
That's
against a
true.
major company like
So
that?
this gathering that Mary, I guess, was invited to or knew about that I was at, the National Employment Law Center and the Legal Action Center and a group out of Philadelphia called the Community Law Legal Services. All these groups were all nonprofits around the country who are doing and enlisting private bar folks to help them on some of these bigger class actions or thicker actions, but also representing folks with EEOC claims. So there's a combination of public-private partnerships that are working on that. I agree, it's a hugely underserved area, and like I said earlier, half the time, Quentin doesn't even know even if he knew to go back and ask Michelle why he didn't get hired, she's not going to tell him. So the reality is this is happening all the time, and the peak, like, what, 1% of these kind of situations are rising that somebody's aware of? So it's a big issue. I mean, it's huge. Yeah, you're right.
Probably answered, but it's intriguing to me. I was trying to figure out the solution, setting aside sort of the negligent dissemination of inaccurate information, which I think there's at least a remedy probably for that.
Right.
But assuming that the information is correct, that they're reporting publicly available arrest information, I mean, you'd have to have a law passed that would make that illegal, right? You'd have to have a law passed which said that we're going to balance the privacy rights of this individual person versus your expression rights, commercial or otherwise, to publish perfectly accurate, true information. And what do you think the chances of that are?
That's huge. We know that the First Amendment issues here are huge, and when it's come up around the country where some legislatures have tried to deal with it, it's a huge issue. Actually, inside the first offender statute in Georgia is actually a clause that says, and, after you know conviction, and employers will not be able to use this information to deny employment. That's a law in Georgia. It's a law. Is it enforced? Are there any teeth behind it? How do you enforce it? There's no teeth behind this. It's actually, I don't know if it's statutory, I think it's statutory, that you can't use an arrest that did not lead to conviction to deny somebody a job. That's a law in Georgia with absolutely no teeth. No teeth. So there's ways to add teeth to what's already in the law in Georgia to say, look, you've got to use accurate information that's right, and it can't be these things. And actually, why the EEOC is so important in all this is a lot of folks around the country, again, the numbers here are staggering, right? Y'all know this. I ain't talking to the choir here. I am talking to the choir. Y'all know this. Is that the vast majority of the criminal justice system has impacted folk of color, poor folk, and often men. And you start to, we're EEOC in that group, it doesn't take long. And what's going to start happening is employers and all these companies selling information and making decisions that it's based on this, what will become a protected class. That's coming. So so the private folk who are just looking at the stock market, making decisions based on whatever, right, as the market would be, are going to have to start making different decisions because lawsuits are coming, and often using existing laws to do it. So this is a ramp. It's a long ramp, but it's starting to happen. So other questions? We haven't talked about juvenile stuff much. I gotta get a juvenile. More juvenile.
How much of the stuff that you talked about, the sheets in the small town stores is online? Are people also accessing all this online? And is there any additional opportunity in the law if you find it through Google?
Well, I don't know. Here's a good example. I'm sitting in DeKalb County right now, right? Anybody here know what OJS is? OJS in DeKalb? So you know what OJS is? Tell somebody what OJS is. Tell.
Online judicial system, you can go on there and look at basically criminal and civil history. You just type in the defendant's name or the parties' names.
So today in this county, from the state orifice, you can go in and find out if Pat's arrested today and she goes to the DeKalb County Jail, it's online tomorrow. I want to type her name in, it shows up. Through OJS, and not just generally, but OJS. I'm sorry, yes?
And there's a website with mugshots for people.
That's right. That's right. So some of this information is absolutely accessible for free without any validation. Get it. Some of these names, we'll find it, or lots of places to look. It's really kind of terrible, actually. And it's gotten worse. What's really happened in 3 to 4 years is just the information revolution has gone ballistic. And then there are companies making dollars off that. I'll sell you information. I gather all that information. I'll sell it to you. So this is, it's part of the equation. It is part of the equation. Yeah, I'm sorry.
And in the metro areas, instead of these sheets that are on the counters at the convenience stores, it all shows up in the online neighborhood watch groups
Right.
who troll the police stations, troll the information that comes out, and the online, those neighborhood watch groups have arrest, the following 6, they follow the police blog and the police blotters, and they get all of the information, and they post it all in the neighborhood watch. So that's the sort of metro wealthier neighborhoods. Everybody who was arrested in their neighborhood makes it onto that
Version of the on the counter in the convenience store. Yeah. It's pretty prolific. Whether it's kind of nuts. But. Well, so Quentin, I messed with you. I used your name, and it's terrible of me. I'm sorry. So now I can call on you.
What got my attention, what brought me here today, but we had a case, DHS and EFACS in that county. We had a case where under the Fatherhood Initiative program, the father was trying to get back his rights, and he was away. He had been arrested some years ago, and he was in the military. Should have cleared him of his rights or whatever, and the child was came into custody. He found out about it, and because of the system, because of the background that we pulled, it had him listed as a criminal, and he couldn't get rights to his kid. So he was in search. And the mother, the rights of the child had been terminated, and so it got my attention.
This is a big deal. We've had, I didn't talk much about what we do at our organization. By way of disclaimer, Carl was on our board for years, way back when. But we've run into this with our work. And our work at the Georgia Justice Project is twofold, really, 2 big chunks of our work. One is representing people in criminal court. We're sort of like a private public defender on steroids, is one way of doing it. We represent folks. We don't take court appointments. We don't take government money, but we get lots of referrals. And if we represent you, and a social worker and a lawyer have to agree, and we stay with you. If you go to prison, we visit you in prison. We help your family visit you in prison. And we're there for you when you get out of prison and help you get back on your feet. That's sort of the core work that even Pat used to volunteer with back when she was in law school. But in addition to that is the civil work we've been doing around the criminal histories and the legislative stuff. So we've run into this because of our core work years ago, where folks, some of our guys who, we represent, we follow them, right? They're doing great. They're back on their feet. They're excellent. And then I've had a couple situations where guys, their daughters or sons went out on drugs, and they're like, the kids are taken away, and then they go to say, look, I'm responsible. I got a job. I got my business. Let me have my grandkids instead of the state raising them. And they're like, sorry. See that conviction on there? See that time you had theft, stolen property? We're not going to let you have them. So the impact of this thing is huge. I'm not, and I understand the state's interest in this. I'm not diminishing that. I'm not saying that it shouldn't exist. I'm not saying that. But at some level here, there's sort of a balancing, just in the same way we're talking about with employers. Is that not only is there a right for some folks that you want, or an opportunity you want them to have, but here's a real opportunity that all the folks in juvenile justice and juvenile child welfare stuff know, is that keeping a family together and somebody who cares about this kid, who's related to him, that's understanding. My understanding is that's sort of what everybody's shooting for. And now we have these collateral consequences that are getting in the way of that opportunity, often even when somebody has been rehabilitated. Now, the situation that brought this right for me about 10 years ago was this guy we represented him on a small case, but like 30 years ago, he had actually gotten convicted of armed robbery, went to prison before we were even around as an organization, on his own, asked for a pardon through the Georgia pardons. He's been pardoned by the pardons and parole system in Georgia, and still the child welfare system would let him have his grandkids. I'm like, and this guy, he has his own business. We used to, I can't tell, it blew me away. So this issue, it's prolific, you're right. And I think at one level, the child welfare folk, the people at a pretty high level who are making these rules, here's what we see a lot. We see whether it's a housing authority, whether it's an employer, they often have these flat lines. They're the Javerts of the world. This is the rule in the story. No gray, no in the middle, right? And so they make a rule. Housing authorities a lot of times are known to say, if you have an arrest, if you get arrested while you're in public housing, you're out, right? And they can live by that rule if you've done any housing work, right? But housing authorities also have the ability to say, we're willing to consider some information. In Georgia, to get a license to be a barber, if you have a conviction on your record, the board, the people who have the power to give you that license, can deny you that license based on a conviction, right?
Any conviction?
Any conviction. And that happens a lot, which raises another whole set of questions. If you've gone to prison and learned to be a barber and you get out, now you can't get a license, because a whole other set of problems. But here's the thing, is a lot of these places allow for discretion. Even those boards who give out those licenses, there are 36 licenses, I think if I remember, or 26 licenses issued by the state, that they can use a criminal record to stop you from getting it. But they have discretion. And to your point about who's going to be able to, if they get denied it, be able to appeal it, is another issue, being accessible to challenge those rulings. But I don't think that opportunity exists in the child welfare world. There's not an ability to come and say, yeah, that's right, and I know the rules say you can do it, but let's talk about whether you should.
Wrong.
Is it Ammar? Okay, good.
I'm going to say that at least in Fulton County. In Fulton County now, we have a parent attorney office, and we have a child attorney office, and we are all independent, entities. And I'm seeing more and more challenges to old criminal records in particular. So they are getting to, there is more argument made to the judge to not just, throw it out just because of a criminal record. So I can only speak for what I see in Fulton County.
Good.
And any county, that can be true, that whereas DFACs may not be able to consent to a permanent placement with a family member, like the home evaluation is denied because of whatever this issue is, the court can grant custody to that family member. And oftentimes DFACs will simply not have an objection. If they can't use discretion, but they use their discretion to just not object and let it go from there. And I've seen that in several different types of settings.
Right.
Going back to your original start of your presentation, you presented us with two concepts of justice, retributive and restorative. I suspect there are others, but rehabilitative probably, whether or not that's real, I don't know. But I'm interested in and you maybe tease us with some other what you might think it is, what you might characterize it now. But I guess the question that one of the concepts in a true retributive system is that at some point in time you paid your debt to society. There's a balance. I mean, if that's the model that you have, then the idea is, and we've created this societal right and debt that needs to be repaid, but at some point it's repaid, and that you hear that all the time. He's paid his debt, he or she has paid her debt to society, and let's move on. But what I think your basic premise here is that there are so many collateral impacts, post-incarceration collateral impacts, that you almost can never pay your debt to society.
That's right. That's right. People, they call it, a lot of people call it, the Bush administration introduced this, second chance, act, this whole idea that we should believe in second chances. I don't like to call it second chance. I like to call it second punishment. Because what we're really doing is you get one punishment. You're right. To this point, Rob, that's exactly right. I have one punishment for doing what I did, whatever that might be. And when it's over, just like Jean Valjean getting out of prison, as draconian as it might have been before he left prison, I am now punished. He's now punished again. I mean, we really have second and third and fourth and fifth and a continuing line of punishments that continue to that person. So they can never dig out of that. And they can never get back. Again, whether it's a job or taking care of my family or whatever. That's exactly right. I think it's right.
This seems to me that if you get the conversation going, and I suspect in this state in particular it might be difficult, but a total revisitation of what those appropriate collateral post-incarceration concepts mean. It's never made total sense to me that, just because you're a convicted felon, you should never be able to vote again. You're impacted by things. Why is that a reasonable result of a conviction?
Well,
it's not in Georgia.
No, but I mean, in some places.
But I know you came from Florida, and here's the thing I like to say about Florida. Y'all remember how many votes supposedly that Bush won in the first election over Gore in Florida? You remember that? What was the number? Some of you help me. You remember? Hundreds, what I hear? How many? 501, something like that. 501. So anybody else remember a number? Okay, I'll give it, I'm going to triple that. Let's call it 1,500. Let's call it 2,000 people. You know how many people in Florida could not vote at the time of that election because in Florida you could not get the right to vote back? You know how many people were disenfranchised because they were convicted felons in Florida at that time? 500,000.
Oh my goodness.
500,000. To this point is you're not just affecting that person's right to vote, and Florida's slowly starting to change this. Georgia's actually pretty good on this, but Florida's terrible. And that terribility, if that's such a verb or noun, now it impacts a larger national scene. And we had a president who might not have been elected president but for that rule. So I'm sorry. Yes, you were here.
I mean, this collaterally affects the whole sex offender role issue. I mean, have you dealt with that at all? And what's the thinking? Is it that you can never be cured? I mean, I've heard that, but it's a non-curable condition.
Yeah. Well, here's what I like. Back to when Carla was asking me earlier. I mean, this is Doug's take on it, right? Is it the things that happen with sex offenders in terms of registering and where they can live and what they can do and what they can't do is really terrible. And it's all part of that wave that started in what year? 1985. Remember that, guys? It started this wave of momentum that says we can just who's going to vote for somebody who's soft on crime? How did you not get elected from 1985 to 2010? He's soft on crime. Don't vote for him, right? So what do? Everybody in the legislatures all around the country could pass more laws that made it harder for anybody, anything criminal, add it on, lump it on, lump it on. So at the height of this frenzy, the sex offender issue became a real, because 15 years ago, this was not a reality in Georgia. It wasn't a deal. And why in 1985 or 86, all of a sudden we get really concerned about this issue of which the offenders have been a really flat line throughout the demographics. I'm pretty sure about that. In other words, sex offenders, it's not like drug offenses or property crimes, which have grown and escalated. It's a really flat line vis-a-vis the population. But we also went crazy. And we got to make it tougher. We're going to make it tougher. We've got to make it tougher. So part of the craziness we've been in, this frenzy, that we're going to make it tougher on every front we can, is starting to ebb, I believe. And even in Georgia in the last 2 years, some of the laws that have changed, I mean, there's been this slight weakening. Like, okay, well, maybe, we're sort of backing off a little bit. So let me just say this. Like I said, my goal line is first, non-convicted. I want to, and I got to tell you, we're concerned about nonviolent felonies and 5-year roll-offs. New York has a great 5-year roll-off, so like South Carolina, basically took New York's version of it. My feeling is we got to start somewhere, and when people bring up sex offenders, I mean, I hate to say it, but that's sort of way over here, you know. I mean, if we can't have people who are not convicted not have negative consequences because they were not convicted, my God, somebody who's convicted of a sex offense, I mean, I'm sorry, baby, you have to wait. You're just going to have to wait. Because unless you know.
We just see that issue a lot, not on the criminal side, but the bald allegation.
Right.
In the home, and then you have the removal.
Oh, that's right. I bet. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Well, one other interesting thing that we see in DeKalb Juvenile Court that has a certain irony to it is one of the collateral consequences is often denial of the ability to get an education. In other words, kids are charged with something that may not have even happened on school grounds, that has come to the attention somehow of a school administrator. The child is suspended or expelled or something. They have a right to a, quote, hearing before they're permanently moved. But often the simple fact of being charged alone without a juvenile court adjudication can cost someone their education, to which not only do they have a right, but it's not going to school is a subsequent violation of the law.
Oh, right. We've dealt. I mean, our office has represented a lot of kids in those situations where we got involved in a criminal setting, and because we do, you know, we're not the public. You know, we have a broad bandwidth we can do. So we've gone to those hearings, we've advocated, and even and kept kids in that school. And then the other thing is the second tier schools, right? I know in Fulton, I forget what they call them all. They changed the names. So the open campuses and the Crims of the world in this county, Crim is actually great compared to Fulton. I mean, I don't want to get. I mean, in other words, there's some really bad second tier consequence. It's like, oh no, we're providing for education. Yeah, go over there, and it's like, and people are getting, it's worse. People are getting really hurt and all that. We all know, that's right. We all know what happens there. So I hear you. I mean, that's right. Just the charge, and we've done a lot of cases where a juvenile has been charged with something, just charged, 2-3 weeks in, a month in, 2 months in, and the whole family's removed from their housing. Right, so you talk about not just that kids got kicked out of school, and now the family has real. So it's huge, and it's all that's without a conviction. So I hear you. I mean, I'm not, you know. Whew, get me started. Yes, ma'am.
In the direct representation component of the Coming Home program, how are the clients that's represented? How are they selected?
Well, actually, right now we don't say no to anybody. It's kind of weird. I mean, don't tell anybody. Because what we do is, for everybody, what we'll do is we bring you, they do an application, we get the rap sheet, let's get everybody to pay the $5, we pay the Clarkston, or who do we pay? Chambly. Everybody in the metro area pays Chambly police to get their rap sheets. It's the cheapest deal going. It's another story. And they got a whole racket going on. It's good. It's $5, it's within 24 hours, it's good. I suggest Chambly, but you're welcome, Chambly Police Department. So we get the rap sheets, and then we look at it, and then we say, okay, if somebody has, we'll sit down and talk to them. But if somebody has 20 convictions, it's like, go with God, my brother, because there ain't much we can do for you. But if you got 3 arrests, dealing convictions, and 1 first offender that looks a little messed up or something, I got a call today about a case that was 25 years old, a non-resolution disposition, meaning when we got arrested, 85, no conviction, and it's still on a record. Meaning, I don't mean dead docket, I mean nothing, which isn't that uncommon. So what we'll do, nothing, it just sits there. And we see this a lot in the homeless population for years. So because we're criminal defense lawyers, what we'll do is we'll say, if we take that client on, we'll go and get that case dismissed from 25 years ago. Because most civil lawyers aren't that comfortable, like, I don't know how to move around a criminal court. We're like, we know how to move around a criminal court. But then we'll say, okay, these 3 arrests, let's see if they qualify for expungement. Let's see if you want us to walk you through it. And then sometimes we do a lot of sealings of records. So a lot of times, whether it's juvenile court, a lot of adult court, this is a big issue with first offender, is that this information that's just out there, until a court clerk seals the record, anybody can come up and ask, I want to get everybody who was arrested and charged in 2002. And first offender or not, dismissed or not, Equifax or somebody like that buys that information, and they just load it up. And they sell it. So what we do a lot of times is try to cut those back doors off by asking judges to seal records So there's a lot of things we might do, but the first thing we'll do is at least talk to you about your record and explain what the law is, what the law isn't, what we can or can't do, or what you can do on your own. So, and we try to do that. And as I mentioned, we have a lawyer in Macon, as I mentioned, in Macon, who's been doing this work. She's based out of Mercer Law School. And so we're doing a lot of cases over Middle Georgia as well, in South Georgia. Yes, ma'am.
What are your income restrictions? Are they the federal poverty guidelines or just?
Come on. I mean, if they could afford a lawyer, they go somewhere else. We don't charge anybody anything. I mean, we want donations, so bring in.
Do you screen them?
How do we screen them? We say, look, if you can afford a lawyer, you get a lawyer. But if you can't afford a lawyer, then we'll talk to you. I mean, if I see them rolling up in a Benz, I might have some conversation. We got this parking lot. I say, well, what you driving? No. I drive a 1996 Saturn. It's out in the lot. I say, if it's better than mine, we got conversation. Any other? Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry.
What exactly is the law in Georgia in higher education in terms of convictions?
This is an issue. I should know this better than I don't know it as well. Some of my staff know better than I do. But we have seen this happen with a lot of our clients and a lot of people that a lot of even state universities will not accept somebody if they have a criminal, especially a felony conviction.
So that's not at the Board of Regents level, that's at the institutional level?
That's a good question. I don't know where that, if it's they say a big P or a small P in terms of policy. Is it a statute? Is it an implementation? Is it just somebody's preference at the admissions level? I don't know.
Have you seen it in the tech schools as well as the?
We are dealing a lot with tech schools lately around the state. So we've been doing a lot of education, and because tech schools, they target a lot of this population where this is a reality for folks. So a lot of tech schools, we work a lot with a school, two schools in Macon, and in the Macon area. I should know the names of the schools. Forgive me. Where they're out there training folks on these, 9-month certificate programs, 1-year certificate programs, 2-year programs, and these are often at risk or poor folk, and they don't want to. They really are really good people, the schools, and they don't want to waste their time or set up the chance for somebody to fail. They train somebody for 2 years, and you're going to go be X, Y, and Z, and they find out, oh wait, you got a criminal history. So we're doing a lot of counseling to the staff of these folks. And saying, look, let's at least align. One of our lawyers did this big thing where she took all the programs that this Middle Georgia school did and aligned it around collateral consequences and said, if you have these convictions, these are the kinds of professions or jobs you will not be able to get. And this is a big issue for nursing home folk, which has a really flat line on this. Elderly care, hardline stuff. And so a lot of these programs are training folks, and they get out, some of them with debt if they're going to the private schools or even the state tech schools have some costs. And these kids or young folk or folks get out and realize they can't get a job. And that nobody likes that. It's a huge deal. And we're doing a lot to educate, mainly on the education side of that. And so it's a big deal. I don't know if I answered it, but it is something. Carla, did you have something? No? Okay, so I'm getting towards the end. I've met your required CLE time, those who are lawyers and need this. So the state bar can give you the stamp of approval. So I know I've been rambling on about lots of things. I don't know if I've focused it in. Melissa, is there anything, would you like me to, anything else we want to do before I wrap it up?
I can't think of anything to ask of you. I think you've been so available with the interaction and to answer the questions that there's not much more we could ask you to exhaust by way of the time.
I'll exhaust. I will. Well, let me say I appreciate y'all coming. I'm glad you all are, hopefully, I know you're interested in this issue, and I think as we work on this issue on the front end, both with clients, we're really excited about some traction we're seeing in the State House and really state houses around the country to deal with this. I learned recently that 7 years, one thing of hope, I'm an optimist. I wouldn't be doing this for 21 years if I weren't an optimist, is that I heard the statistic recently that 6 years ago, there were less than a handful, like less than 15 cities, counties, or states that had a ban the box initiative. Ban the box meaning, the box is, have you been convicted of an offense? I learned recently that 2,000 different jurisdictions, 2,000 jurisdictions around the country, city, county, state, have passed laws that say we will take out the box, we ban the box. That to me is an incredible momentum to say that even folks in those wonderful state and county governments are realizing that this is a huge issue for people they want to create opportunities for. So I think there's an awareness of this issue. There's people who want to deal with it, whether through mass litigation, from legislation, down to just representing folks. And if you all want to be helpful to us, we have lots of volunteers that help us. And if you want to help with legislation, I'll get all your names from Melissa, and I'll put you on our mailing list.
Absolutely.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.